phrase varapo yirape. There the Gemara, the Talmud is talking about the fact that anytime I undergo a medical procedure, or anytime I take a medication, I'm supposed to recite a little prayer beforehand. Yehi Ratzon, basically, may it be the will of you, God, that this asek should be the refuah, that this activity, this medical therapeutic activity that I'm endeavoring in should be for refuah. So there's a lengthy actual text that the Gemara lays out there, and it includes the notion that you are the true healer, and that in reality, really it shouldn't be the behavior of human beings to seek therapy. We should rely solely on God, and we should, perhaps like Christian scientists, not pursue medical treatment. But people have accustomed themselves to this. Behavior has gone awry, and we now do pursue, so we ask you to help us in this endeavor. So the Talmud goes on to describe that Abaya disagreed with that text. He says that's not correct at all. It's not inappropriate to pursue health care. It is not considered to be inappropriate in terms of belief and trust in God. On the contrary, he says, we have a pasuk varapo yirape, that you have to pay the health care cost of the physician who helps the person whom you injured, and that gives us the license to treat and the mandate to treat. And therefore, Abaya says that's not the correct philosophy. Therefore, it is an obligation to treat, and it's an obligation to be treated. Both the patient and the physician have an obligation. A lot of the differences between Jewish bioethics and general bioethics revolve around this notion, this general concept of privilege, of right versus mandate. In Judaism, many things are mandated. They're obligatory. It's not just an issue of justice or fairness. It's actually an obligation that one could develop. We don't maybe perhaps all full time to discuss this at full length, but it's an actual mandate. I have an obligation to take care of my health. If I don't pursue getting my cholesterol checked, and I know I have a high cholesterol, if I don't take Lipitor, when my doctor has prescribed Lipitor, if I don't take hydrochlorothiazide or Capitan or whatever to treat my hypertension, I am in violation of a mandate that I have based on what God has given me as an obligation. It's not just that I have the right autonomy. Autonomy is a notion that Judaism does believe in very strongly, but not to the extent that autonomy, being perhaps the single most important modern-day concept in bioethics that dictates so much of what goes on, autonomy, although autonomy perhaps in medical insurance issues is less of overriding consideration. Maybe there should be more autonomy, or maybe there's too much autonomy. Maybe that's the problem. Some aspects don't have enough, and some have too much. But so perhaps autonomy has hurt the medical, but autonomy since 1991 has become the overriding consideration in general bioethics. So Judaism believes in autonomy. It's not that we don't have the right to make decisions, but there are certain things that we do not have the right to make decisions. We have decisions about if we're going to ask ourselves what our obligations are. We always have the right to not fulfill our obligations, but by Jewish halachic standards, we have an obligation to seek medical care, and we have an obligation to provide medical care. And part of that provision, apparently from the pasuk, as some Rishonim on that Gemara say, implies that unlike other mitzvos, based on other Talmudic passages in the Dorim, that generally speaking, when I perform a mitzvah, a religious precept, I'm not permitted to accept compensation for that. I'm not allowed to charge for it. The classic example has to do with rabbis. So I'm a rabbi and a physician, so I'm not supposed to charge for either of those things. I don't have the right to charge for being a rabbi or a physician. So that's why you have to go to Wharton School and make a real living, hopefully. But a person is not supposed to charge for religious acts. A person is not supposed to charge for performing a circumcision. A person is not supposed to charge for teaching Torah. And a person is not supposed to charge offhand for treating another person, because that is a religious obligation that I have. So some say that medicine is an exception to that rule. That's how some Rishonim suggest in Maseches Brachos, some medieval commentators, that the Torah explicitly gives the doctors the right to collect. Varapo yirape, that I have an obligation to pay for the health care costs, means that the Torah recognizes for whatever reasons, we can philosophize about the reasons or look at the sources and try to determine the reasons, but for whatever reason, there are some Rishonim who have the opinion that medicine is an exception, that even though it is a religious mandate and a religious precept that I am performing, I'm still permitted to charge for it. That's one opinion. That is not reflected in Shulchan Aruch, however. The Code of Jewish Law explicitly says that I'm not permitted to just charge wantonly for my medical expertise. In fact, in Shulchan Aruch, it distinguishes between two categories. Between Chochmah and Limud, and Torah and Schar Batola. I'm not allowed to charge for my expertise, and I'm not allowed to charge for the advice and the counseling that I give a patient. My expertise tells me is that for this patient, this particular drug would be the best choice for his or her infection. And I then prescribe the medication. I tell them they should take a cephalosporin, for example. So I have knowledge based on my education, and I give that knowledge over, I impart that to the patient. So it says, that I'm not allowed to charge for. So what can I charge for? I can charge for schar torach and schar batola. Torach means that if I spend a half an hour traveling to the patient's home, I can charge for basically the time that I spent, or for the tircha, for the effort I put in. If I'm going to my office and all the patients are coming to me, so then I can only charge for the 15 minutes it takes to get from home to my office. That's not going to amount to very much. And even if I make home visits, I can charge a lot more than I can if I stay in my home. If I have to make rounds in the hospital and I have to take time out to travel, so I can charge for the effort. Some poskim even say I can even charge for the effort it takes me to write the prescription, because that's not considered to be part of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is giving them the advice, using my expertise, writing the prescription. I'm not sure. It's an interesting case. Dr. Abadi is a gastroenterologist. So when he performs, let's say, colonoscopies, so he can charge for, so you have to analyze what he can charge for and what he can't charge for. He can charge for the effort that it takes to perform a colonoscopy. There's a certain tircha, there's a certain effort. It's not just effortless. He can't just be daydreaming while he's doing so. He has to be focused. So there's a certain tircha. The expertise, though, that the knowledge that goes into it, so it says that he can charge for. So you have to figure out where that works its way out in terms of DRGs and other determinations. That I'm not clear on. Schar Batola, though, that's the most important one. Schar Batola literally means that I have two jobs. I'm an accountant, and I'm also a physician. So I could have been spending time doing someone's tax return while I went to the hospital to see the patient. And if I would have done a tax return, I could have charged the person $500. So because I took time out of my other profession to attend to a person's needs physically, medically, so I can charge for the time that I spent away from my other profession. If I don't have another profession, so what kind of schar batola? That's what the poskim say. If I don't have another profession, so how am I supposed to charge for schar batola? The fact that I could have been an accountant, but I'm not an accountant. The fact that I could have been an attorney, but I'm not an attorney. So schar batola means that I took time out from other activities that I could have rightfully earned money, and I spent time away performing the mitzvah, so I'm entitled to be compensated for the other activity that I could have been engaged in. If, for example, I'm a physician and I'm offered an administrative position, and I declined that administrative position, and I could have taken that administrative position, so then every time I treat a patient and perform a specific religious precept, I could argue that I could have been an administrator and making a certain salary, and for that I could charge. One could argue being an administrator is the biggest mitzvah because you're facilitating all of the religious precepts in the hospital. So I think Dr. Jacobs truly and sincerely and appropriately believes that what he does is not only financially important, but religiously and spiritually important as well. But let's say I could have been hired by Pfizer to be a researcher, and they would have paid me $250,000, and I declined that offer. I'm qualified, but I declined to be a researcher for Pfizer. So I could have been making $250,000. So I'm allowed to then charge my patients over the course of a year $250,000 because I could have been doing that. That's schar batola. The question, though, is most physicians are not necessarily in that position, so what right do physicians have to charge higher fees than just the expenses that they have? Some folks can say, I can charge for my medical education. So if I spent $100,000 getting educated, so then I can charge over time $100,000. So that won't last very long. That will take That will be gone very quickly, so that won't last my career. I'll be able to practice for half a year, maybe. That will be it. So what can I do for that? So some postscripts say, interestingly, Dr. Steinberg, who wrote the classic encyclopedia in Jewish medical ethics. It's really wonderful. You should really, all of you should have it. I don't own one yet. I will, God willing. It's in Hebrew, and it's also been translated by Dr. Rosner into English. It's just really excellent as a